Hi, and welcome back. In this section, we're going to talk about unpacking the Texas AEL standards by analyzing them and connecting them to benchmarks. Just as a reminder, the structure of ESL content standards and benchmarks differs from other areas because the sub-areas are broken down into levels of successive learning, extensions of previous learning. In the old format, they are located in the Texas Education and Literacy Standards, page 35 through 47. On this slide, you see a pictorial or a graphical representation of how you can think about the different levels across the different sub-areas that are part of the ESL standards: listening, speaking, reading, and writing, and levels 1 through 6. So why are we talking about standards now before we start planning lessons? As you recall from previous workshops, the approach that we're taking is the backward design process, which starts with identifying the desired results rather than, as is often the case, starting with learning activities. So the first step is to identify the desired results. The next step is going to be to determine assessment evidence. In other words, answering the question, how do I check that my learners have actually learned what I set out for them to learn? And finally, plan learning experiences and instruction that are connected to what my identified desired result might be. So another way of thinking about standards-based teaching is to think about designing lessons with the end in mind. In other words, asking yourself the question first, what is the learning outcome that I would like for my students? And the standards that have been developed by the AEL board are basically outlining for you the set of potential outcomes or ends that you should be working towards in your different courses. Now, of course, many of you have been through a year-long content standards instruction, but I want to be sure that we all start training on the same page by taking a look at the standards together. Reading standards is a lot like reading any other nonfiction text. What that means is it requires careful analysis and interpretation. And in order to understand or interpret what the standards are suggesting, it also requires careful attention to language. Now, in your set of handouts, you have a handout that's titled How to Read Standards 2.0, and in that you'll see that there are 6 subsections. Those subsections talk about the content area that you're working on, in this case ESL, then the sub area in which you're working, so in this case it's going to be listening, speaking, reading, and writing. Then the content standard and sub area standard, which lists the set of standards at the top of each page for each section. Finally, below that, you're going to see the benchmarks. These are describing the set of skills that learners need to develop and achieve to meet the more broadly stated standards, and they've been divided by the level of your learners, moving from beginning and low beginning all the way to high intermediate and advanced. Finally, there are 2 new sets of materials that are embedded in the new set of standards that are going to be released in January and that you have received an advanced copy of. Those are the ONET elements related to standards and benchmarks, and the ONET developed detailed work activities and industry examples. What's nice about these 2 additional features is that it gives you some concrete examples of the ways to think about a given standard and benchmark in direct relationship to a workforce embedded context. Okay, so let's get started with thinking about what standards are about. So the first thing to be thinking about is really every standard is comprised of a type of learning outcome. But there are multiple kinds of learning outcomes packed into any given standard. So here there are 4 different potential learning outcomes that a standard might include. They might involve the acquisition of a new skill. They might involve meaning making. They might involve transfer of information to a new context, or they might involve application. In addition to the 4 types of outcomes that are listed on the previous slide, you can also think about a standard as helping to determine a learning outcome with respect to the type of understanding you would like your learners to be able to display once they have mastered or achieved the outcome. So here there are 6 different facets or types of understanding that learners might display. They might be able to explain, they might be able to interpret, they might be able to apply, they might be able to shift perspective or shift the perspective of another with their language, they might be able to emphasize, and they might be able to self-assess. So there are many different types or facets of understanding that a given standard might be pointing to. For the next several slides, we're going to be working through the handout that's labeled Handout 5, Unpacking Standards. More specifically, the title of this handout is TEL-TEX Academy AEL Unpacking Standards and Benchmarks Worksheet. It's divided into 5 different sections on 4 pages. We're not going to have time to work through every single section of this handout, but the additional blocks that we don't address today during the workshop are things that you can work in on your own as examples of how to unpack standards. Okay, so let's get started. We're going to be looking at unpacking standards and later benchmarks, which is essentially the same approach, in 2 different ways. The first way is to think in terms of the types of understanding connected to a standard. So let's take a look at one. The content area here is English as a second language. I'm reading from the slide. The sub area is listening skills, and I've selected standard F, comprehend questions in order to engage in conversation. So let's ask ourselves, what does comprehend mean? Does it mean make meaning of and transfer? Does it mean to analyze? Or does it mean to state and explain what experts say based on what I've heard from a reading? All 3 of these are possible learning outcomes connected to the verb comprehend in this particular standard F. So our first lesson is how we teach and how we assess based on a standard depends on how we as individual teachers determine what the specific aim of a given standard will be for a specific lesson. So now if you'll turn to your handout on page 1, the section number 1 called Connecting Standards to Learning Outcome Types. You'll see just below that title that the 6 types of understanding are listed for you there. And the task for you right now, together with a partner, is to figure out what are the potential types of learner outcomes that are connected to the 2 different standards that are listed for you on the handout. The first one is also here on the slide with reference to speaking skills and standard F. Demonstrate appropriate speaking skills and strategies for persuading and discussing. The second one listed on the handout is listening skills, standard C. Listen to, follow, and give directions and instructions. I'll give you a moment to talk with your partner about this and fill in the blank space on the top of page 1 of the handout. Okay, so at the beginning of this little section, I talked about the fact that there are 2 ways of unpacking standards. The first is to look at them holistically and think about what the type of understanding is that you want your learners to develop. What we saw from that is that virtually any standard can be connected to virtually any one of the types of outcomes. So it's up to you to decide for a given lesson which type of understanding is the most appropriate, because that's going to have an impact on the type of activities that you design. So now the second way in which you can unpack a standard is by paying careful attention to language. So let's take a look at the following standard, also from listening skills. Listen to, follow, and give in directions and/or instructions. So let's unpack that. In order to unpack a standard, what you want to do is look at the different important features of language, starting with a focus on verbs. So here you can see that there are 3 different verbs referring to different types of actions that are connected to this standard: listen to, follow, and give. So what you might also notice is that although this standard is a listening skills standard, one component of the standard is connected also with either speaking or writing, namely give. Next, in unpacking the standards, is to focus on the nouns. And so here we've circled them for you, directions and instructions. So with this kind of unpacking, you have a little bit more information that will help you to determine which type of understanding you're hoping that your learners will focus on. Finally, notice here below in parentheses, I've put focus on adjectives. So in this particular standard, there are no adjectives, but oftentimes adjectives and adverbs have been included in standards that help to emphasize the particular area in which the standards writers were directing teachers to think about in terms of learner outcomes. So the careful unpacking of a standard by looking at the language is something that can also be done at the level of benchmarks. If you'll turn to page 2 of your handout, you'll see at the top 2, Unpacking Standards, Focus on Language. And you'll notice below that you have a section where you can fill out a particular standard. So I'd like you to pick one. Then also pick a level and also pick a benchmark that is part of the set of benchmarks that are associated with the level. Take a few moments and write those out in the space provided to the right. Next, what you're going to do, either with colored pencils or by underlining and circling or whatever other process you would like, and or you can simply fill them in below. Fill in the main verbs, which are the actions or skills that learners will be engaging in. Then also fill out or underline or circle the nouns, which refer to the main concepts or subject areas that students will be working on. And finally, if relevant, circle the key adjectives or adverbs that may be present in either the standard or the benchmark. Okay, so we've talked about 2 different ways of unpacking standards. The first was a holistic approach that allowed us to look directly at what is the type of understanding that a learner might develop as a result of working on an activity that was geared towards achieving this standard. The second is a careful reading of the language. This will help you if you're unsure about what the learner outcome type is that you want to focus on. So the second was to write out and circle verbs, nouns, and adjectives to point you in a particular direction in terms of what a standard might be aiming to measure. If you look on page 3 of your handout, you'll see a section entitled Connecting Standards to Learner Outcome Types that provides a grid similar to the one on this slide that can essentially be used by you as a worksheet to try out a couple of different sub areas and standards and think about how looking at the language, verbs, nouns, and adjectives can help you determine what the learner outcome type might be. Okay, so the next important point to think about is that standards don't actually work by themselves. When we teach, we're actually engaged in a number of different activities that might be geared towards a variety of different standards. So here's a quote from the Common Core State Standards. While the standards delineate specific expectations in reading, writing, speaking, and listening, and language, each standard need not be a separate focus for instruction and assessment. Often, several standards can be addressed by a single rich task or activity. So one of the things that you want to do if you're going to be doing backwards design or standards-based teaching, before you get started on orienting the activities in your lesson plan, is to take a careful look at the standards across the different sub-areas and determine which ones go together. So here's an example of 3 different standards that you might find would easily go together in a set of activities. From the sub-area listening skills, standard C, listen to, follow, and give directions and/or instructions. It can be nicely paired with speaking skills, standard B, give directions to places and instructions for accomplishing specific tasks. And the standard within writing skills, standard F, write with logic, organization, and accuracy. So as you think about these standards, you might be able to start to see a lesson and a series of activities within that lesson unfold. So at the bottom of page 3 of your handout, you'll see a section that's called 4, Standards Work Together. And your task is to find 2 sets of 3 standards across sub-areas that work together. Before you do this, think about the ways in which your next lesson, think about a lesson that you'll be teaching in the not terribly distant future, and try to put several standards together that align with that lesson that you have in mind. Okay, we've spent a fair amount of time talking about standards. Now I'm going to shift my focus to the benchmarks that are listed under the different levels of language proficiency that our learners might have. When we focus on lesson plans, although we start with the standards, it is benchmarks that provide the appropriate level of specificity from which to derive the assessments that are going to be the next component of our lesson planning. Why might this be? Well, it has to do with an understanding of the fact that as learners progress through their developmental stages, they're going to be able to do more and more complex tasks that are associated with the same type of standard. So let's take a look at an example. So here we have the content area again, ESL, the overarching sub-area or sub-area listening skills, and the standard F, comprehend questions in order to engage in conversation. Let's take a look at the 2 different levels. Level 4, low intermediate, benchmark 3 says the following: actively listen and comprehend information and provide a response to a question that requires making inferences from spoken language. So you can think about the ways in which this particular benchmark aligns with the standard F, comprehend questions in order to engage in conversation. And it's quite specific to be able to comprehend information and provide a response. If we move on to level 5, high intermediate, we can see something a little bit different in benchmark 8. Use background knowledge and contextual clues to participate in conversation. So a lot more expectation is placed on the learner in this benchmark in order to be able to do the same thing, namely comprehend questions in order to engage in conversation. So now we're moving on to the last page of the handout that's titled Unpacking and Designing Benchmarks. So there are 2 different blocks on your handout, one of which is titled Find a Standard and a Corresponding Benchmark. And the second one is find a standard and construct a benchmark for a particular level. So what's important to think about in terms of standards and benchmarks is that in some cases, like the example on the previous slide, the standards are aligned in such a way with the different levels that you can find a logical progression between the benchmarks as you're moving from level 1 to 2 to 3 to 4 to 5 to 6. So what I'd like you to do in the first block at the top is to find a standard and then find a corresponding benchmark for at least 2 levels in which you can see the relationship between the standard and the corresponding benchmarks. Then in the second half of the handout, one of the things that you're going to realize as you were doing the first part is that you can't always easily find a benchmark that aligns with every standard listed for the sub-area. So if you can't find a benchmark, what do you need to do? Construct a benchmark that will allow you to have a specific level of focus on what your learners are currently able to do and what you would like them to be able to do as a result of the lesson that you're planning. So in the second set of blocks, you can find a standard and then construct a benchmark of your own that you believe aligns fairly well with the level of proficiency of your learners. So as a way of concluding this section, I want to go over a number of tips that have been provided by the authors of the Understanding by Design Guide to Advanced Concepts in Creating and Reviewing Units, namely Wiggins and McTighe. They give us a set of tips for using standards and benchmarks in lesson planning. The first is to look at all key verbs and clarify and highlight valid student performance in which the content is used. The second is to look at the recurring nouns that signal the big ideas that are marked in the standard. Tip number 3 is to identify and analyze the key adjectives and adverbs. They're going to help you to determine valid scoring criteria and rubrics that are related to successful performance against the standards. This is something we'll be talking about more in the next section of the workshop after lunch. Tip number 4 when you're looking at the standards is to identify and/or infer the long-term transfer goals by looking closely at the highest level standards and indicators for them, or inferring the transfer goal from the content and justification for the standard. In other words, even if you're working with low beginning students, one of the things you want to be thinking is where they're going to be going next as they develop more language. So even again, if you're working with low beginning students, you want to look at the intermediate benchmarks and at the advanced benchmarks and at the standards to have a target in mind that you're building towards. And finally, tip number 5 is to consider the standards in terms of the long-term goal of autonomous performance. So the standards are set as things that students should be reaching for, not things that students can already do. The purpose of your lessons is to help them move along that trajectory towards autonomous performance. Finally, just a few words about some other places where you can find some help in thinking about how the ESL content standards and benchmarks work. One area is to look at the ELPS, the English Language Proficiency Standards, that have been put together by a separate group of individuals. These two sets of standards work or have very similar objectives, but are organized in slightly different ways. So it's useful to look at the English Language Proficiency Standards if you're struggling with how to unpack a particular content standard in the area of ESL. So here's one way to be thinking about how you might use the ELPS or English Language Proficiency Standards as another guide as you're unpacking the ESL content area standards. The ELPS standards are organized into 10 content-specific practices that an adult learner would need in order to participate in academic coursework or employment. Each standard is further divided into 5 proficiency levels, and note that the ESL content standards have 6 levels, ranging from basic to advanced, which more explicitly describe knowledge and skills that would be expected, not at the beginning, but at the completion of each level. So that is the same for both the ELP standards and the ESL content standards. Here's some other important things to know about the ELP standards. Standards 1 and 8 are focusing on interpretive skills, reading and listening, and so they can give you some help in thinking about types of understanding or learner outcomes that are related to inferring or interpreting. Standards 3, 4, and 7 are focused on productive skills like speaking and writing. Standards 2, 5, and 6 are interactive in nature, and they require an integration of receptive and productive skills, which in the case of virtually all, but of course not all, classroom activities, is what we're aiming at. Interactive kinds of environments where both listening and speaking, or reading and writing, or all 4 skills are being activated at once. And finally, standards 9 and 10 are focusing on the linguistic structures of English, namely grammar, that support all of the other skills. So by way of conclusion, remember to always pay attention to the language in the standards, the language in the benchmarks, and use those as a guide to help you unpack and understand what particular learning outcomes you might want to design for your learners for particular lessons.